doesn't belong here." All this Vance said it quietly, but not quietly enough. The words landed in the middle of a silent conference room at the Hartwell Institute, and everyone heard them. The man he was talking about was standing right there. His name was Desmond Osei. He was 31 years old. He had a worn leather bag over one shoulder, a slightly too short tie that he'd clearly borrowed, and shoes that had been polished so carefully you could tell he'd done it himself that morning. He didn't flinch when Vance said it. He just set his bag down on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat. That was the first thing people would remember later, not the insult, the sitting down. Desmond had grown up in Decatur, Georgia, in a house where the ceiling in the kitchen leaked every time it rained, and nobody fixed it because there was always something more urgent. His mother worked nights at a fulfillment warehouse and days at a dry cleaner. His father had left when Desmond was 7, and come back when he was 11, and left again when he was 14, and by then Desmond had stopped marking the dates. What he did instead was math. Not the kind they taught at school, though he was good at that too. The kind he found in the back of the library, in textbooks that smelled like the 80s, in photocopied problem sets from competitions he'd never been invited to enter. He worked through them at the kitchen table while the pot on the stove bubbled and the TV in the next room played whatever his mother had put on before she fell asleep in her chair. He was 12 when he first encountered a proof that stopped him cold. It was about prime distribution, the way primes thin out as numbers get larger, but never disappear, never stop stretching on into some infinite distance that no one had ever fully mapped. He sat with that proof for 3 days. He didn't understand it yet, but he understood that he wanted to. That wanting was the thing that carried him. He got a partial scholarship to a state school. He worked the rest, dining hall, then a tutoring center, then writing code for a small logistics company on weekends. He graduated in 3 years because he couldn't afford a fourth. He applied to graduate programs and got rejected from the first 6. The 7th, a mid-tier program in Ohio, accepted him with a modest stipend, and he moved into a studio apartment with one window and started working. His dissertation was on a narrow, almost unsexy corner of analytic number theory. His advisor was kind but distracted, always half-present, always chasing his own work. Desmond mostly taught himself. He read everything. He emailed researchers he'd never met, and sometimes they wrote back, and sometimes they didn't, and either way, he kept going. By the time he graduated, he had one published paper and a name that meant nothing to anyone outside a small cluster of specialists. He applied for academic positions and didn't get them. He applied for research fellowships and didn't get those either. He spent 2 years doing contract work, statistical modeling for insurance companies, forecasting for a regional bank, and telling himself it was temporary. Then someone from his Ohio program forwarded him an email. The Hartwell Institute was launching a new initiative. They were looking for young researchers in quantitative fields to compete for a 2-year fellowship. The prize came with a salary, lab access, a small travel budget, and most importantly, time. Unstructured, uninterrupted time to work on whatever the researcher believed mattered. Desmond applied. He didn't tell anyone he'd applied, not because he was superstitious, because he learned, slowly and with some pain, that hope is easier to carry alone. The Hartwell Institute occupied 3 floors of a building in Cambridge that always smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. It had been founded in the 1960s by a man who'd made money in manufacturing and spent the rest of his life convinced that the country was wasting its mathematicians. The fellowship it ran was prestigious in a specific, insider way, well known among people who cared about such things, invisible to everyone else. Aldous Vance had been a senior fellow there for 11 years. He was 62, white-haired, with the kind of deliberate manner that some people mistake for wisdom. He had published important work in the 1990s, work that had genuinely moved his field, and he had spent the decade since protecting the reputation that work had earned him. He served on selection committees. He gave keynotes. He wrote letters of recommendation for students he liked and declined to write them for students he didn't, which was a category that seemed to overlap significantly with students who weren't from the kinds of places he considered serious. He had not been on the Hartwell Fellowship Committee that selected Desmond. He hadn't even known about Desmond until 2 days before the orientation session, when he'd seen the list of incoming fellows and looked up the name and found a state school, an Ohio program, no notable publications, no institutional pedigree he recognized. He'd sent an email to the committee chair that night. The chair had replied the next morning politely but firmly. The selection had been made, the process had been thorough, and the committee stood by its decision. Vance had read that email 3 times. Then he'd closed his laptop and gone to bed. But he remembered it. He was still remembering it 2 days later when he walked into the orientation room and saw Desmond Osei sitting at the conference table with his borrowed tie and his polished shoes, and said, just loudly enough to be heard, what he said. He doesn't belong here. The room had 9 people in it. 4 incoming fellows, 2 committee members, an administrative coordinator named Faye who had worked at Hartwell for 20 years and had seen most things, and Vance. The other 3 fellows were a woman named Priya, who'd come from a postdoc at Caltech, a man named Ezra, who'd done his doctorate at Chicago, and a woman named Sylvie, who'd spent the last 3 years at a research center in Paris. All 3 of them looked at Vance when he said it. Then they looked at Desmond. Desmond looked at the table. Not in shame. Faye, who was watching from her chair near the window, would describe it later as something more like calculation, like he was deciding something, like he was running a quick internal count and arriving at a number he'd already expected. Then he looked up. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at the committee member closest to him, a woman named Dr. Adeza Nuwasu, who ran the Institute's computational division and who had, in fact, been the one to push hardest for Desmond's selection. Should we start? Desmond said. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't cold. It was just a question, asked in a normal voice by a man who had somewhere to be. Nuwosu looked at him for a moment. Then she said, yes, let's start. The fellowship structure gave each researcher their first month to settle in, get their workspace set up, meet the staff, outline their project. There were no formal presentations yet, no evaluations, just orientation and access. Desmond spent his first week in the library. He wasn't avoiding people, he just had something he needed to find. There was a paper. He'd heard it referenced twice in the past year, once in a seminar and once in a footnote, about a specific approach to a problem in his area. An approach that someone had started and then apparently abandoned or published somewhere obscure. He wanted to read it before he did anything else. He found it on the 9th day. It was from 1987, published in a journal that had since folded, and it took him another 2 days to get a physical copy through interlibrary loan. When it arrived, he read it in one sitting, ate a sandwich without tasting it, and then read it again. The approach was interesting. It was also wrong in a specific, subtle way that the author had clearly not noticed. The error was small enough that it had survived peer review, small enough that no one in the 38 years since had apparently bothered to go back and check, but it meant that the conclusion the paper claimed to prove was actually unproven. There was a gap, and the gap, Desmond realized, was exactly where he'd been trying to dig for the past 4 years. He went back to his office. He closed the door. He started writing. The mid-fellowship review happened 6 weeks in. It wasn't high stakes, just an informal presentation where each fellow shared what they'd been working on, gave the others a sense of direction. 20 minutes each, then questions. Priya went first. Her work was on a machine learning application that she explained clearly and well, and the room responded warmly. Ezra went second, presenting something about topological methods that was dense but clearly sophisticated. Sylvie was third, her project involving a collaboration with a team in Berlin that sounded already half-finished. Desmond went last. He put up one slide. It was a single diagram, a sketch really, hand-drawn and photographed, showing 2 curves and the space between them. There's a 1987 paper, he said, that most people in this room have probably heard of and nobody has read in a long time. A few people shifted in their seats. That was already a slightly unusual thing to say. He named the paper. He named the error. He put up a second slide showing where, precisely, the proof failed, a step that looked like a lemma but was actually an assumption dressed up as one. He was careful and exact. He wasn't performing. He was just showing what he'd found. The way you'd show someone a crack in a wall that had been painted over. The gap that creates, he said, is about 30 years old. Nobody's worked in it because everyone assumed the paper closed it. He paused. It didn't. He put up a third slide. This one was dense symbols, notation, a structure that looked to anyone who didn't work in the field like noise. To the people in the room, it was not noise. Vance was sitting at the far end of the table. He'd been half listening until the second slide, and then he'd started listening completely. His expression didn't change, but he'd lean forward just slightly in the way people do when something has their full attention and they don't want it to. "I've been working on a framework," Desmond said, "to address the gap. I'm not done. I'm probably 4 months away from knowing whether it works." He looked around the room. "But I think it works." There was a pause. Nwosu said, "Can you walk us through the third slide?" Desmond walked them through it. It took 11 minutes. Nobody interrupted. When he finished, Vance said, from the far end of the table, "That's assuming your lemma in step 4 holds." "Yes," Desmond said. "And does it?" "I think so. I have a partial proof. I expect to have the full proof within the month." "You think so?" Vance said. The inflection on think was precise. It was the tone of a man asking a question and simultaneously answering it in a way designed to be heard by everyone in the room. Desmond looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since the orientation session. "Yes," Desmond said. "I think so. The same way Wiles thought Fermat's last theorem was provable before he proved it. Certainty comes after the work, not before." The room was very quiet. Vance had nothing to say to that, not immediately. 3 weeks later, Desmond had the full proof. He didn't announce it. He checked it. Then he checked it again. He sent a draft to a contact at MIT, a researcher named Tokenbo who specialized in exactly this area and who he'd been corresponding with by email for 2 years without ever meeting in person. And Tokenbo wrote back in 48 hours with 2 small corrections and 1 word, solid. Then Desmond went to Nwasu's office and knocked on the door. He showed her the proof. She read it standing up, which Faye, who happened to be walking past the glass wall, would later say was something she'd never seen Nwosu do. She stood there for 12 minutes, reading, flipping pages, going back to a specific section twice. Then she said, "Does Vance know?" Desmond said, "Not yet." Nwosu was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's going to say this was already known." "It wasn't," Desmond said. "I checked." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you what he's going to say." Desmond nodded. He already knew that too. The formal presentation was scheduled for the following Thursday. All fellows and senior researchers were expected to attend. Faye sent the calendar invites. The room filled. Vance arrived 2 minutes late and sat in the back. Desmond stood at the front. He had a clear structure, the original paper, the error, the gap, the framework he'd built, the proof. He moved through it methodically, the way he'd learned to do back when he was teaching calculus to first-year students who were scared of it. You don't rush the part that matters. You don't skip the part that's hard. At the 20-minute mark, Vance raised his hand. Desmond stopped and looked at him. "This approach," Vance said, "is very similar to a technique that Morrow and Lin developed in 2009. "I'm familiar with Morrow and Lin," Desmond said. "Their technique addresses a different problem in a related family. The structure looks similar at the surface level. The underlying logic is distinct." "That's a debatable characterization," Vance said. "It is," Desmond said. "I'd be happy to debase it after I finish." He said debase by accident and meant debate, and someone near the front laughed, a short surprise sound. And just like that, a little of the tension went out of the room. Desmond kept going. He got to the section on the proof. He walked through it step by step. He was at the lemma in step 4, the one Vance had singled out in the review, and he could feel the attention in the room sharpen. He went slowly. He showed every connection. He did not rush the part that mattered. When he was done, he put down his marker and looked at the room. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Ezra, who was sitting near the middle and who had been taking notes for the last 40 minutes, said, "If this holds, and I think it does, you've closed something that's been open for 3 decades. "Yes," Desmond said. and the implications for the distribution question are significant, Desmond said. That's the next part. Another pause. Vance said, from the back of the room, in a voice that was more careful now, the lemma in step 4. Yes, Desmond said. Walk me through it again. It was not, this time, the tone of a man answering his own question. It was the tone of a man who wanted to understand something and didn't want to admit why. Desmond walked him through it, slowly, completely, without impatience. He showed every step. He answered every question. When Vance pushed back on a particular notation choice, Desmond acknowledged the alternative and explained his preference. When Vance asked whether a certain assumption could be relaxed, Desmond said he'd considered that, briefly described why he'd chosen not to, and said it was a good question worth exploring in future work. He was not unkind. He was not triumphant. He was just someone who understood something deeply and was willing to share it. That was the part Faye would talk about later when she described this to her husband over dinner. Not the proof. Not the fight. The willingness. He didn't make Vance feel stupid, she said. He just kept teaching. The room cleared slowly. People stopped at the front to ask questions, to introduce themselves, to say they'd like to read the draft. Tokenbo had emailed again. He'd shared the draft with 2 colleagues, both of whom wanted to correspond. Someone from the computational division mentioned a problem their team had been stuck on for months that might connect. Desmond answered everything. He stood at the front of the room for 40 minutes after the presentation ended, and he didn't look at his phone once. Vance left early. He didn't say anything on his way out. Later, about a week later, he sent an email to Osei. It was 3 sentences long. It acknowledged that Desmond's work was original. It noted that the result, if it held through external review, was significant. And it said, in the precise, careful language of a man choosing words he could not be made to regret, that he had perhaps been premature in his initial assessment. Nwosu forwarded it to Desmond without comment. Desmond read it once. He saved it in a folder on his desktop that he labeled, simply, Record. Then he closed his laptop, put on his coat, and walked to the tea station. He had a call that evening with his mother. He wanted to tell her that things were going well, without making her worry about how they hadn't been. He stood on the platform and thought about the gap, the 30-year gap in that old paper that everyone had assumed was closed. He thought about how long it had been sitting there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look at it directly instead of assuming. He thought about all the things that get assumed. The train came. He got on. Through the window, as the city went past, he watched the lights. There are rooms in this country that don't have your name on the door. There are people who will hear you coming and decide before they've seen a single thing you've done that you took someone else's place. And those people aren't always wrong in their world, they're just wrong about yours. Desmond Osei proved a 30-year-old gap closed when it wasn't. He did it alone, in a library, with a fellowship he was told he had no business holding. The question isn't whether he belonged there. The question is, how many others didn't get the chance to find out as they did? I keep thinking about the shoes. Desmond polished them himself. The morning of the day, someone told him out loud, in a room full of people, that he didn't belong. He knew what that room was going to feel like before he walked into it. Some part of him had been preparing for that exact moment his entire life, not because he was paranoid, but because he was paying attention. And still, he polished his shoes. He showed up. He sat down. That's the part that stays with me. There's a version of this story where Desmond argues back right away, where he makes Vance feel the weight of what he said, where the confrontation is loud and satisfying. But that's not what happened. What happened is that Desmond looked at the table for a moment, ran some internal count, and then asked if they could start. He redirected the energy. Not because he was passive, because he understood something that Vance never did, that the work was the answer, that the only argument worth making was the one you made on the page. I think about how much character that requires. Not confidence exactly, character. The kind that doesn't perform itself. The kind that knows the difference between what feels good in the moment and what actually moves things forward. Vance had spent 11 years building walls out of credentials and assumptions. He decided before Desmond said a single word what Desmond was capable of. That's not just prejudice. That's intellectual laziness dressed up as discernment. And the thing about that kind of laziness is that it always loses eventually because it stops learning. Vance stopped learning somewhere in the 90s. Desmond never did. The cause and effect here isn't complicated. Desmond spent years doing the work that nobody was watching, in rooms that didn't have his name on the door, on problems that other people had given up on. That accumulation of honest effort is what made the discovery possible. Not luck, not a break. The 30-year gap in that old paper was waiting for someone who was still curious enough to go back and read something everyone else had stopped questioning. That was Desmond, because Desmond had made a habit of questioning things. That's the through line I can't stop tracing. The integrity of showing up every day and doing the work without an audience. The intelligence to see what others had missed, not because he was smarter in some abstract way, but because he looked where they didn't bother to look, and the sheer will to keep going through rejection letters, contract jobs, a studio apartment with one window, years of being invisible, and not let any of it make him smaller. Those three things together, the honesty to do the work right, the mind to do it well, and the endurance to keep doing it when nothing external rewards you. That's what closed a 30-year gap. Not a fellowship, not a prestigious address, not a name that opens doors. Desmond saved the email from Vance in a folder called Record. He didn't forward it to anyone. He didn't post about it. He just saved it and called his mother. I think that's the most important detail in the whole story, because the point was never to make Vance feel bad. The point was to finish the work, and he did.